Hello, everybody. Decided to change locations and read on my couch because it's comfy and because I felt like it. So, I will be reading today chapter 7 through chapter 8 for 1984. And if you're in this book, it is starting on page 139, and I don't have the other book in front of me right now. But it's chapter 7, so not a big deal. So, Winston had woken up with his eyes full of tears. Julia rolled sleepily against him, murmuring something that might have been, "What's the matter?" "I dreamt," he began and stopped short. It was too complex to put into words. There was the dream itself, and there was a memory connected with it that had swum into his mind in the few seconds after waking. He lay back with his eyes shut, still sodden in the atmosphere of the dream. It was a vast, luminous dream in which his whole life seemed to stretch out before him like a landscape on a summer evening after rain. It had all occurred inside the glass paperweight, but the surface of the glass was the dome of the sky, and inside the dome everything was flooded with clear, soft light in which one could see into interminable distances. The dream had also been comprehended by, indeed, in some sense it had consisted in, a gesture of the arm made by his mother, and made again 30 years later by the Jewish woman he had seen on the news film, trying to shelter the small boy from the bullets, before the helicopters blew them both to pieces. "Do you know," he said, "that until this moment I believed I had murdered my mother." "Why did you murder her?" said Julia, almost asleep. "I didn't murder her, not physically." In the dream he had remembered his last glimpse of his mother, and within a few moments of waking the cluster of small events surrounding it had all come back. It was a memory that he must have deliberately pushed out of his consciousness over many years. He was not certain of the date, but he could not have been less than 10 years old, possibly 12, when it had happened. So we're about to go back into a memory. So this is everything that happened to his past. And we know that he was really, really young when this happened. So this is probably pre-revolution, or this is right when the revolution happened. His father had disappeared sometime earlier. How much earlier he could not remember. He remembered better the rackety, uneasy circumstances of the time, the periodical panics about air raids and sheltering in tube stations, the piles of rubble everywhere, the unintelligible proclamations posted at street corners, the gangs of youth in shirts all the same color, the enormous queues, that's a line, a queue is a line, outside the bakeries, the intermittent machine gun fire in the distance. Above all, the fact that there was never enough to eat. He remembered long afternoons spent with the other boys in scrounging around dustbins and rubbish heaps, picking out the ribs of cabbage leaves, potato peelings, sometimes even scraps of stale bread crust from which they could carefully scrape away the cinders, and also in waiting for the passing of trucks which traveled over a certain route and were known to carry cattle feed, and which, when they jolted over the bad patches in the road, sometimes spilled a few fragments of oil cake. So he's remembering a time when nobody had enough to eat and everybody was scrounging around for food, and just that memory of being with those other children and just trying to find any sort of scraps that they can. When his father disappeared, his mother did not show any surprise or any violent grief, but a sudden change came over her. She seemed to have become completely spiritless. It was evident even to Winston that she was waiting for something that she knew must happen. She did everything that was needed, cooked, washed, mended, made the bed, swept the floor, dusted the mantelpiece, always very slowly and with a curious lack of superfluous motion. Superfluous is a new word, and, well, actually, you might have read this word last week. It's like extra, over, too much motion. Like an artist's lay figure moving of its own accord. Her large, shapely body seemed to relapse naturally into stillness. For hours at a time, she would sit almost immobile on the bed, nursing his young sister, a tiny, ailing, very silent child of 2 or 3, with a face made simian by thinness. Very occasionally she would take Winston in her arms and press him against her for a long time without saying anything. He was aware, in spite of his youthfulness and selfishness, that this was somehow connected with the never-mentioned thing that was about to happen. He remembered the room where they lived, a dark, close-smelling room that seemed half-filled by a bed, with a white counterpane. There was a gas ring in the fender and a shelf where food was kept, and on the landing outside there was a brown earthenware sink, common to several rooms. He remembered his mother's statuesque body bending over the gas ring to stir at something in a saucepan. Above all, he remembered his continuous hunger and the fierce, sordid battles at mealtimes. He would ask his mother naggingly over and over again why there was no more food. He would shout and storm at her. He even remembered the tone of his voice, which was beginning to break prematurely and sometimes boomed in a peculiar way. Or he would attempt a sniveling note of pathos. We know that word. What's pathos? It's an appeal to emotions. In his efforts to get more than his share. His mother was quite ready to give him more than his share. She took it for granted that he, the boy, should have the biggest portion, but however much she gave him, he invariably demanded more. At every meal, she would beseech him, like beg, she's begging him, not to be selfish and remember that his little sister was sick and also needed food, but it was no use. He would cry out with rage when she stopped ladling. He would try to wrench the saucepan and spoon out of her hands. He would grab bits from his sister's plate. He knew that he was starving the other two, but he could not help it. He even felt that he had a right to do it. The clamorous hunger in his belly seemed to justify him. Between meals, if his mother did not stand guard, he was constantly pilfering at the wretched store of food on the shelf. So he is not very nice to his mom. But we have to remember that he's a little kid and he doesn't understand what's happening and doesn't understand why there's no food and doesn't understand why the food is being rationed in the way it is. He's just hungry and that's all he knows. And he's just like, I'm just gonna get food however I know. And he's like, I know I'm starving my sister. I know that I'm starving my mom, but I need food. And so he is willing to steal it from her. So I don't know about you, but I have some very complicated feelings about that because I don't know that. I mean, he is a small child at this point, but I'm still like, that's kind of icky. Okay. One day, a chocolate ration was issued. There had been no such issue for weeks or months past. He remembered quite clearly that precious little morsel of chocolate. It was a 2-ounce slab. They still talked about ounces in those days. Between the three of them, it was obvious that it ought to be divided into 3 equal parts. Suddenly, as though he were listening to somebody else, Winston heard himself demanding in a loud, booming voice that he should be given the whole piece. His mother told him not to be greedy. There was a long, nagging argument that went round and round with shouts, whines, tears, remonstrances, bargaining. His tiny sister, clinging to her mother with both hands exactly like a baby monkey, sat looking over her shoulder at him with large, mournful eyes. In the end, his mother broke off 3/4 of the chocolate and gave it to Winston, giving the other quarter to his sister. The little girl took hold of it and looked at it dully, perhaps not knowing what it was. Winston stood watching her for a moment. Then with a sudden swift spring, he had snatched the piece of chocolate out of his sister's hand and was fleeing for the door. Winston, Winston, his mother called after him. Come back, give your sister back her chocolate. He stopped, but did not come back. His mother's anxious eyes were fixed on his face. Even now she was thinking about the thing. He did not know what it was. That was on the point of happening. His sister, conscious of having been robbed of something, had set up a feeble wail. His mother drew her arm around the child and pressed its face against her breast. Something in the gesture told him that his sister was dying. He turned and fled down the stairs with the chocolate growing sticky in his hand. I think it's a very complicated and emotional moment, not only for Winston in the past, but I think for Winston now when he's remembering this, because I don't know, do you think that Winston at that age really understood that his sister was really dying, or do you think that he just was like, oh, everybody's being dramatic and I'm hungry and I need food? That's kind of something to think about, what we think Winston might know and what he definitely doesn't know. And I think that kind of maybe might influence what we think of Winston and how we view him.